Well, watching some more of the Bedini two-disc set of disc number 38, disc 1 and 2, from Energy from the Vacuum, the Tesla switch, he says, no, you can't put a capacitor in place of the battery. Well, this is why. Because a battery is an electrolytic foundation. A capacitor isn't, right? But an electrostatic field, doesn't that start to look like an electrolytic slosh that's charging up in the midst of two plates? Isn't the electrolytic solution a kind of dielectric? A chemically variable dielectric? To do the same thing that a dielectric does in a capacitor, store the charge. So you would think, right? Oh, a capacitor should work, but it doesn't. Yet, the closest thing to an electrolytic bath, I would imagine, is an ionic cloud in an electrostatic field. In other words, you don't just have an electrostatic field, you have a medium, such as a gas, in that electrostatic field, behaving like an electrolytic bath. And so that's why Richard Hackenberger was able to swap out his second set of batteries, and in place of that, use the electrostatic field involving the chassis, and most importantly, the airspace inside that they flushed out to keep the ionic charge low enough so that arcing would not occur, because you don't get arcing in an electrolytic solution, do you? You get ion movement between the plates, which you don't get in a capacitor. There is no ion movement. The holes, the electron holes, will fill up, I suppose you could say, with electron charges, but there's no movement between the plates. The ions don't move. The charge holes, the electron holes, don't move. And that's why it don't work. But in a situation in which you've got air, let's say, in an electrostatic field, you've got ions that can move around. In fact, Richard Hackenberger had to flush out the excess to prevent arcing, because arcing means you've no longer got a capacitor, you certainly no longer have an electrolytic bath, you've got a conductor. It's got a completely different situation. So I think an electrostatic field with a fluid medium within the field might justify the substitution out of batteries. So it's kind of like a capacitor, but it's not, because it's more like a battery. But it's an electrostatic battery instead of an electrolytic battery. It's just a different kind of battery. And that's the point and purpose of an electrostatic field. I thought it was to amplify the radio signals. So it's not the Hutchison effect. When he says you can't take out the battery and replace it with a capacitor, then I'm thinking, wait a minute, I know it can be, we can take out the battery, but how? By putting in a different battery, an electrostatic battery. That's the only way to explain what does an electrostatic field have to do with this situation. It's acting like a battery. You know, Bedini did so much with batteries. And we think, well, but that doesn't look like a free energy device. But the EV Gray motor used to work with batteries, sort of. They tried to make it work, but it didn't work because the high voltages were just too high and the batteries were blowing up. They probably didn't have enough batteries. Not slow enough acting. Yeah, they didn't have enough spread of batteries to diffuse the charge that was coming in so rapidly. The batteries couldn't respond fast enough, so maybe if they had more batteries, like hundreds of gazillions of batteries, it wouldn't have blown up. But then you couldn't put it in a car, could you? You'd have to put it underneath your house. You'd have to build a whole other story underground where you put your battery bank, and so that it wouldn't blow up. You'd have to have lots and lots of them, which kind of makes sense, you know. If you store heat from a thermal collector up on the roof, that goes into a big basement or cellar, vat of oil or water or something to store all that thermal energy during the nighttime. Anywho, so this is no different, something just big enough. So if you're going to have a high energy state, then apparently an electrostatic field is the way to go. And then you can scale down the size and keep it manageable within the context of a car, which is what the EV Gray motor was designed to do. So that's the secret to how to take out batteries. You don't substitute capacitors. You substitute an electrostatic battery of sorts. And that's possibly why compressed air was in the Nazi U-boat design, because they were working with an electrostatic battery instead of capacitors, which is the wrong way to do it, to substitute for batteries, electrolytic batteries, to do the job that Bedini is doing. So all the circuits that Bedini works with, the batteries can be taken out. Now he does have solid-state versions in which the rotor, I like to call it the rotor, not the motor, because there's no torque to speak of. You know, a ceiling fan torque is not torque. So I just call it a rotor. But that's merely substitution of the rotor. That's not substitution of the battery. So I don't know too much about Bedini's stuff, I have to admit. I don't know if he came up with a substitute for batteries, because he says in this video you can't take out the battery and replace it with a capacitor. So what would you replace the battery with? Which is the next question. And I think it's an electrostatic form of a battery, an electrostatic field, in which possibly air is your electrolytic bath, so to speak, your charged air mass within the charged field. Anywho, I'm repeating myself ad nauseum, but I think that's how you solve that problem. Anyway, moving right along. I'll keep watching. Maybe there's more stuff. It's neat to watch these things and then try to look for new ways to interpret. You know, it's cool. I love it. Although he says, well, do it right the first time before you monkey with it. I know, it's such a temptation to monkey before you get anything to work in the first place. I'm such a bad boy. Okay, whatever.